Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to tonight's event, Vision, Values, and American Politics. My name is Mike Miltenberger. I am the freshman member at large for the Harvard Republican Club here. And I'd like to take a few minutes to talk to you tonight about why our speaker is so important to college Republicans both here and around the country. I arrived on campus at a very interesting time as the nation and this school was getting ready for the 2004 election. And I joined the college Republicans right away. And in addition to our normal activities of making a community for like-minded political students and waging the war of ideas on campus, and of course, in the college sense, waging the war to be the best party on campus, we also tried to make a difference in who the next president of the United States would be. We registered voters, we campaigned door-to-door in New Hampshire, and of course, we partied for the president. We are college students. And this all culminated finally in watching the election returns on election night, actually in that auditorium right there as a club. And we sat down and the crowd was filled with excitement, but more importantly, we were filled with the sentiment of having belonged to something greater than ourselves, of having made a difference in the country. And it's in people like our speaker tonight that college Republicans here and around the country can feel encouraged that our actions are important and that they do make a difference. And eventually, actions and efforts on a campus can become actions and efforts in a nation to make a difference. And it's in people like our speaker that we can see that what we do can and will make a difference in the future of this great nation. I'd like to turn the podium over now to Dean Elwood of the Kennedy School, who will introduce our speaker further.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you all for coming. I think this should be quite a good and interesting and important evening. It will be even more interesting and important if you have a cell phone, if you'll turn it to vibrate or off at this time. Michael mentioned sitting in the room watching the election results and thinking about caring about something larger than oneself. And I think that very much characterizes the Kennedy School and the people that are attracted. The idea that you can make a difference, that your voice and your ideas, but also your commitment can be involved. Now, before we begin, I'd like to thank IOP fellow Roger Simon from U.S. News and World Report for bringing Ralph Reed to the Kennedy School. Roger, are you here? I guess not. But thank you to Roger for his efforts. Interesting question. We here at the Kennedy School and many other institutions talk about democracy. We believe deeply in democracy. We're constantly promoting democracy. And anyone who's lived in a democracy, I was just down in Mexico, had this experience, spends their entire time complaining about the outcomes of democracy and frustrated that people in democracies don't listen to the wise ideas of who's ever having to sit at the table. Democracy is all about the competition among ideas, but I think even more importantly, it's the competition among ideals. It's about values, it's about what gives meaning and what a people really want. If everyone sort of was clear on what we all wanted, then it would be kind of a technical thing, and we just get the right technocrats in and so forth. But this democracy at its best involves hearing and listening and involving the voices from around the world. I mean, from around whatever nation or whatever is going on. And here at the Kennedy School, our goal, and certainly my goal as dean, has been to create the opportunities to listen to a variety of different values and visions and ideas and ideals. And tonight is no exception. And I'm very, very proud to have Ralph Reed here. Now, Ralph has been described by a leading Democrat I know as the best political mind in the business. Now, I mentioned that to him a moment ago, and he said, that's because he only knows Democrats. So he apparently is better than Democrats, and there's certainly some evidence to suggest that. But I think that one of the things that Ralph did at a relatively early stage was to recognize the importance and the potential of taking people who care deeply about issues of religion and values and see how that can be translated into democracies and politics. Whether you admire that or are troubled by it, it seems to me the vision and the values that are associated with that are a very important thing for all of us to have the chance to listen to. So I want to say a couple of things about Ralph. He received his BA from the University of Georgia and a PhD in history from Emory. From 1983 to 1985, he was the executive director of the College Republican National Committee, and he helped re-elect Ronald Reagan, and as the president garnered 59% of the youth vote. And starting from 1989 to 1996, he was the executive director of the Christian Coalition, and he expanded the fledgling direct mail outfit from about a budget of $200,000 to $27 million. A remarkable achievement. And indeed, I'm thinking about doing that very thing here at the Kennedy School. During his tenure, the Christian Coalition grew from about 2,000 members to 2 million. His organizational plan played a huge role in promoting the Contract for America, which helped usher in the Gingrich Revolution as the Republicans took control of the House of Representatives for the first time in 40 years. And after being elected chairman of the Republican Party in 2001, he was the Southeast Director for Bush-Cheney campaign in 2004. And most recently, he's decided to take a step back from behind the scenes and tactician to being a candidate for office when he announced his candidacy for the Lieutenant Governor of Georgia. This from a man who will be 44 years old in June. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ralph Reed.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Michael and Dean Elwood. It's great to be back at the Kennedy School. I've been here a number of times in various manifestations, and it's always a great honor and a great privilege to come back to the Institute of Politics at the John F. Kennedy School of Government of Harvard University, because I think there was no individual and no life in American history that better represented an ethic of public service and a dedication to the importance of public service than the life of John F. Kennedy, and someone who knew that there was more to life than personal wealth, and there was more to life than personal aggrandizement, that it was important to serve your fellow men and women in order to build a better nation and a better world. I might also add that this is the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum, and John F. Kennedy Jr. was a friend. I knew him when he was at George Magazine. He interviewed me, and we would sort of kid each other a little bit as we sent notes back and forth in the ensuing years. And he was a great young man, and we miss him. He had a joy for life, and he had a spirit of comedy. That for those of you who didn't know him, he could walk into any room and meet any person. And when he walked out, they liked him. And that's a rare skill. So it's really a great honor to be here. And I want to talk just briefly and then leave time for questions and comments. Talk about the state of American politics. And I'm going to walk through four main features of the state of our politics, with an emphasis on the 2004 elections, but also looking ahead. And we live in very interesting and exciting times. In some ways good, in some ways bad. We're involved in a global war against terrorism. We faced the greatest national security crisis since the fall of the Berlin Wall, and potentially since Allied troops moved into Berlin in May of 1945. We've seen some very interesting things happen politically in our country, including the 2000 election, a 37-day recount controversy, a presidential election that ultimately went all the way to the Supreme Court and was decided by 537 votes in a single state out of 105 million. And I think that many of the features that have created these interesting times are likely to be with us for a while. And the first is a rough parity between the two political parties. If you take the period from 1996 to 2000, It was the first time since the 1880s that you had 3 presidential elections in a row in which no candidate received a majority of the votes cast, and that you had 3 congressional elections in a row in which the outcome of control of Congress was decided by 1% of the vote or less. And I still think that there's rough parity between the parties. Michael Barone of U.S. News called it a 49% nation. The idea that 49% of the nation was Republican, 49% Democrat, and very few were a jump ball. That's confirmed by a history of polling in presidential campaigns going back to the 1970s. If you went back to the 1976 election between Carter and Ford, you had about 16% of the electorate that was truly independent, unaffiliated with either party. They were just really largely voting for the candidate. In some polls, by the way, it was much higher than that. During the 1980s, during the Reagan campaigns, it varied from anywhere from the low teens to the mid-teens. But by the time we got to the 2000 election between Gore and Bush, that percentage of the electorate that was truly undecided, truly unaffiliated and independent had fallen to about 7% of the electorate. So you had roughly, 44 to 45% on one side and 44 to 45% or more on the other side, and the percentage that was undecided was extremely small. And but I think the Republicans have enjoyed an advantage in the last 2 or 3 elections, primarily because we've had a better leader and a better candidate. And I think, particularly in an evenly divided electorate, I think that's consequential. Just as in the NFL, a combination of salary caps and free agency and revenue sharing has made it possible for any team to beat any other team on any Sunday, it has shifted the priority on who wins the Super Bowl to the quarterback position and the coach. Because in the end, if you think about it, if every single team's salary is the same, and if players are allowed to move around among the teams, then pretty much the 22 people you put on the field every Sunday, unless you're just doing a lot of things wrong, the talent's pretty equal. So having a superior quarterback and having a superior coach, as it pains me to say the New England Patriots have had in recent years, you get a huge advantage. And American politics is sort of a civic version of the NFL. You have rough parity demographically. You take the union vote and the minority vote and single women's vote and other constituencies in the Democratic Party, and then in the Republican Party, hunters, sportsmen, gun owners, small business owners, evangelicals, observant Catholics and Jews, and you pretty much put the same number of people on the field. The same is true in terms of financial parity. Historically, the incumbent president has had a huge advantage financially. Not true in 2004. George W. Bush's campaign raised and spent, I'm doing this from memory, I might be off a little bit, but not much. I think we raised and spent about $280 million, and John Kerry raised and spent about $250 million. So it was really pretty even. And in fact, that really understates how much the Democrats raised and spent, because the so-called 527 organizations raised and spent another $400 million themselves. And the Democrat-leaning 527 groups outspent the Republican-leaning 527 groups about 2 to 1. So you see, you have financial parity, you have demographic parity. That really is the root of this so-called red state, blue state nation and this rough polarity between the two parties. Against that backdrop, in George W. Bush, I know he's underestimated, but he is one of the most skilled and gifted political figures of his generation. This is a man who is the only person to be elected and then re-elected to a second term in the state of Texas in the 20th century. When he was elected governor of Texas, out of 28 statewide elected officials in the state, 9 of them were Republican, 9 out of 28. When he left office and resigned the governorship 6 years later to become President of the United States, all 28 of the 28 state offices were held by a Republican, and there wasn't a single statewide elected Democrat left in the state of Texas. And this is the state that gave us Lyndon B. Johnson and Sam Rayburn and John Connally. It was an extraordinary achievement. And when he left, they had gained control of both the state Senate and then shortly after he left, the state House. If you look at the state of Texas today, the governor's race in Texas in 2006 is really all about the Republican primary. Most people believe that whoever wins the Republican primary will be, by default, the next governor of the state of Texas. That's what Texas used to be like for the Democrats. Then in 2000, he was elected president. He became the first president since the Civil War to gain control of the U.S. Senate in an off-year election in 2002. And then in 2004, he became the first incumbent president since Franklin Delano Roosevelt to gain U.S. Senate and House seats while being reelected. Last person who did that was FDR in 1936. The last Republican to do it was Calvin Coolidge in 1924. So you are witnessing a political leader with gifts and accomplishments that we haven't seen in either party since Franklin Delano Roosevelt. These are remarkable achievements. He has added a lot to our party and given us that edge in an otherwise evenly divided electorate because he has an almost unique ability to both energize the core supporters of his own party while building bridges and reaching out to people who haven't always felt welcome in his party. So, for example, in 2004, he had an 89% job approval among Republicans. I saw one poll in a congressional race in my home state of Georgia where the president's job approval among the Republican primary voters in that district was 93%. That, by the way, was higher than Reagan had going into the 1984 election. Reagan was 85, the president was 89. So his whole team was not only for him, but energized and excited about him. But then in addition to that, he overperformed in historic terms across the board. So that when you look at the electoral map on election night 2004, it doesn't look that much different than 2000, does it? Kerry won New Hampshire, which we had won 4 years earlier. We won New Mexico and Iowa, which they had won 4 years earlier. But other than that, there was really no change. And yet underneath that map, a lot of things changed. For example, the president won 44% of the Hispanic vote, the highest percentage of the Hispanic vote to be won by a Republican presidential candidate, incumbent or challenger in the history of our party. And he did so winning the presidency by only 3% of the vote, 2.5%, 3% of the vote. Reagan had gotten 38% of the Hispanic vote, but he won it in a 59-41 landslide. So to have the Hispanic vote rise that much in what was really a close election was a much more impressive accomplishment than even Reagan's. He won the Catholic vote, 52 to 47%, against the first Catholic nominee for president of either party in 44 years. He won the veterans vote against a decorated Vietnam combat veteran. He closed the gender gap from a 16-point gender gap in 1996 to an 8-point gender gap in 2000 to a statistically insignificant 4-point gender gap in 2004. Kerry won the women's vote, but very narrowly, only 52-48, really within the margin of error. That's a huge accomplishment for a Republican. And so the result was that not only did he carry a solid South and a Midwest, but he made some inroads into some places that no Republican had really been able to venture before. So there are a lot of things that I like about George W. Bush, but one of my favorites is that he's not only the first MBA to ever sit in the Oval Office, he's also the first general manager of a professional baseball team to ever sit in the Oval Office. And as a result of that, he knows that politics is a team sport. So he didn't just seek a personal victory the way, say, Richard Nixon did in 1972 or the way, say, LBJ did in 1964. He invested his political capital in key U.S. Senate and House races, and as a result, the Republicans today have the highest number of House and Senate members since 1946 and the highest number of state legislators since 1954. Why is that important? It's important because once the confetti falls and the balloons have been swept away and the inaugural is over and they've removed the viewing stand from the front of the White House, you have to govern. And the difference between 55% of the vote and 61% of the vote may mean a lot in terms of ego gratification, but it means very little in terms of governing the country. And to have 55 Republicans in the Senate and 235 some odd Republicans in the House, the president has the ability to move his agenda forward. So that's the first thing, rough parity between the party, as I said, for demographic and structural and financial reasons, but then an advantage for the Republicans based on the leadership of George W. Bush. Second key feature of our politics today is a transformation of our politics to more of a European model of ideological parties. If you go back to earlier periods of American history, our political parties did not necessarily crisply or accurately reflect the ideological differences within the country. That was certainly true in the 1950s, for example, when the Democratic Party included Northern liberals like Adlai Stevenson and Southern segregationists like Strom Thurmond and Dick Russell. In fact, if you go back and you read Adlai Stevenson's acceptance speech at the Democratic National Convention, he actually says in that speech, we passed a civil rights plank at the convention this week that neither side is happy with. Those who favor integration and civil rights aren't happy with it, and those who favor segregation aren't happy with it. And he says, and that is the way it ought to be for a truly national party who aspires to represent everyone. It is unthinkable to imagine a Democratic nominee making a statement like that at a Democratic convention today, and probably for a Republican too. Because if you really think about it, the Republicans have become the conservative party, and the Democrats have become the liberal party. And there are exceptions to that rule. There are conservative Democrats like Zell Miller of my home state of Georgia. It's a shrinking number, but they're still there. And then there are more moderate Republicans like Rudy Giuliani or Arnold Schwarzenegger or George Pataki. But for the most part, the parties have become ideological parties. That, in my opinion, also has given the Republicans an advantage, at least in my part of the country. When I was growing up in the South 30 years ago, there were a lot of voters who were more conservative than me, who were what we called yellow dog Democrats. They voted straight ticket Democrat below presidential level, and they wouldn't vote for a Republican. Well, today, for the second election cycle in a row, George W. Bush carried all 14 states of the South, all 173 electoral votes. His average margin in those states was 58 to 42%. And of the 26 U.S. senators from the South, only 4 are Democrats. Bill Nelson of Florida, Mary Landrieu of Louisiana, and Blanche Lincoln and David Pryor of Arkansas. Those are the only 4 Democrat U.S. senators left in that part of the country. Now, why is that important? It's important because George W. Bush won the national popular vote by a little over 3 million votes, but he won the South by 6.2 million. It's also important because if you come out of the South without a single electoral vote, which is what happened to Al Gore and it's what happened to John Kerry, in order to get to the magic number of 270 electoral votes, you have to carry 74% of all the remaining electoral votes in the Electoral College, which is a mathematical possibility, but politically it's Mount Everest. You can't have anything go wrong, or you can't get to 270. And to give you a feel for what an important transformation this is in our national politics, when John F. Kennedy ran for president in 1960, the South represented 1/4 of the Electoral College and 1/4 of the population. So if Kennedy didn't do well in the South, it was hurtful, but it wasn't fatal. And yet, even with that, John F. Kennedy got a higher percentage of the vote in Georgia than he got in Massachusetts. But today, the South is the fastest growing region in the nation. If it were a country, it would have the third largest GDP in the world, ahead of Japan. And so, as it continues to grow economically and demographically, it becomes a bigger problem for the Democrats. Now it's a third of the Electoral College, and by the year 2050, it will be between 35 and 38% of the entire electoral vote. So again, as the parties begin to accurately reflect the values and the geographical differences in our country, the Republicans have a slight, and I want to stress a slight, advantage. That's also reflected, by the way, in the voting patterns of voters based on faith. In 2000, 14% of the electorate said that they were evangelical or born-again Christians. In 2004, that figure rose to 23%, and George W. Bush won 87% of their votes. So it was a very important vote for the president, but it was not the only factor, as I indicated earlier in talking about the Catholic vote, the Hispanic vote, the veteran vote, the small business vote, and so forth. I want to take just a second and shatter the myth that the key to the president's reelection was the values or religious vote. It was an important factor, but if he'd had a 15-point gender gap and he'd have lost the veterans vote and gotten 20% of the Hispanic vote, he still wouldn't have been reelected, even with the faith-based vote. Third feature is a rise in the potency and effectiveness of grassroots politics. At the Bush campaign, we signed up 1.4 million volunteers. We registered 3.3 million new voters. We reactivated 7 million inactive Republican voters who were on the voter rolls but weren't really voting. And in the final 7 days of that campaign, those 1.4 million volunteers made 15 million voter contacts, either by phone or in person or going door to door. And the irony is that in the age of the internet and satellite television and fax machines and cell phones that you can email pictures back and forth on, all of that technology has brought us back to the old-fashioned politics of the 19th century. It's door-to-door, face-to-face, person-to-person campaigning. And I think the Republicans did a better job of that in 2004 than the Democrats did. There are a lot of reasons for that that are too complicated to go into tonight, but I can tell you that in Florida, where I spent a great deal of my time because I chaired the Bush campaign in the Southeast, and once John Kerry was the nominee, that was Florida. Nothing else in the Southeast was really competitive. I was in Bay County, Florida on the Saturday before the election. Bay County is where Panama City is located. It's a semi-retiree community, but not exclusively retirees. It's a rapidly growing county, a lot of second homes, a lot of people coming down from the north. It's a beautiful place right on the Gulf Coast. And it's rapidly growing in population, and it's about a 70 to 75% Bush county. And I was in a little barbecue joint in the middle of nowhere in Bay County on Saturday, whatever that was, October 31st, at about 5 o'clock, speaking to about 50 volunteers. And the chairman of the Bush campaign pulled me aside and he said, I was chairman of Jebb's campaign in 94 and 98 and 2002, and I chaired the president's campaign in 2000 and 2004. So I know this county like the back of my hand. And I just want to tell you, by close of business today, 40% of all the registered voters in this county will have already voted by either absentee or early voting. We had done such an effective job in our organizational ability of identifying who our voters were, we were going to their doors and knocking on their door and had a car waiting on the curb ready to take them to the polls for the 14 days before the election. And early voting, by the way, is coming, and it is going to transform American politics. The idea of Election Day being the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November is gone. In Georgia, we had early voting this year for the first time, I believe, for 7 days. In Florida, it was 14 days. It's one of the reasons why we had the highest voter turnout since 1968. So here in this county, this is Saturday. We still have Sunday and Monday to go, and 40% of all the voters have already voted. And if you want to know why the exit polls were wrong, that's why. The reason why the networks thought that John Kerry was going to win Florida was because they were only interviewing voters who were walking into the voting booth that day. They were literally missing 40% of our vote. And they just didn't realize that the world has changed. Through absentee ballot and increasingly sophisticated grassroots voter identification techniques and early voting, I believe you're going to find very shortly that half of the vote will be cast before the polls ever open on Tuesday morning. I personally think that's a positive thing, because I think if you can go into a grocery store and you can fill your grocery basket and then slide a credit or a debit card and, pay for your groceries, or not even go to the cashier and just go to the self-checkout and do it all that way, and if you can buy a concert ticket online, I don't know why we shouldn't make voting more convenient. There's no reason to have a 19th century voting system in a 21st century country. So that's the third feature. And then fourthly, a disaggregated, fragmented media universe that has changed the way we talk to each other and the way we get news and information. In 1980, when Ronald Reagan was running for president, 90% of all the households in America with a television set on were watching one of the three major networks, ABC, CBS, or NBC. Today, those same households, only about half of them will be watching one of the major networks, and everybody else will be watching something else, either cable or they'll be on the internet. And I think the rise of the internet is going to be as transformative to our politics as television was, beginning really with the 1960 campaign and the televised debates between Nixon and Kennedy. In 2000, 22% of all the voters said they got all or most of their information about the candidates from the internet. In 2004, that figure rose to 30%. There are 75 million voters who went to the internet primarily either to give money or to volunteer or to visit a campaign website to get more information or to get their news from the internet. And you saw a little bit of that in the Dean campaign. I think you saw even more of it in our campaign. We had over 5 million Americans who attended parties for the president. And I don't know how many people here ever participated in a party for the president, but it was really a pretty amazing thing. You could agree to host a party for the president in your home, go to our website, this was entirely web-driven, sign up, materials would be emailed to you, you would be given a conference call to call into that night, then you were asked to type in the names and the addresses of the people that you were going to invite to your party. And then our website invited them for you with an email. And attached to the email, it said, you've been invited by Frank Burns to a party for the president at his home at this day, at this time. And then the software program figured out where the person lived and where you lived, and it attached as an attachment a MapQuest map with directions on how to get there, and your phone number and email so that they could get in touch with you. We mobilized 5 million people without expending a dime, mailing anything, or calling anybody, all web-driven. We had 7.5 million unique emails, and we had over 11 million unique visitors to our website. And in my own campaign right now, I'm making extensive use of the internet to do the same thing. I think it's going to transform American politics. I think it's going to make it more citizen-friendly, and I think it's going to make it easier for people to get involved and to make a difference. So those are the four main features that I see. Rough parity between the parties. What will happen after Bush is gone, I don't know. I know for the minute we clearly have the advantage. I think he's not the only reason, but he's a big reason. Secondly, the rise of grassroots politics. Thirdly, the triumph of ideology and the organization of our parties. And fourthly and finally, a disaggregated media universe. That's why we have a so-called 49% nation. That's why our politics are the way they are today. I want to close, and then I'll open it up for questions by quoting the president, who said in his inaugural address, speaking primarily to young people, that you should give yourself to something greater than your wants, greater than yourself. And in so doing, in your days, you will not only add to the financial wealth of our nation, but to its character. That is the mission of this university. It is the mission of this school of government. It was the mission of the man for which it is named. And whether we're Democrats or Republicans, that is a mission that I believe is uniquely American, and I applaud you for dedicating yourself to it. Thank you all very much, and I'll leave some time.
All right, there are microphones placed here, up here, here, and here. We'll now take some questions. I will give our usual reminder that, first of all, I'd like you to identify yourself, and I'd like to remind you that the very best questions have two characteristics. They are short, and they end with a question mark. One question each, please.
Good evening, Mr. Reed. My name is Leif Dormsjo. I'm a master's student at the Kennedy School.
Mm-hmm.
Federal intervention in the Terry Schiavo case tramples on the constitutional doctrine of limited government, sets a dangerous precedent by giving one family special standing. Equally disturbing, conservatives have ignored the instruction in Genesis that a husband and wife have a sacred bond, one flesh. And the New Testament's promise that life does not end with death, but rather everlasting life is achieved through faith and ascension to heaven. Moreover, 2/3 of Americans feel that it is inappropriate for Washington politicians to interfere in the painful private decisions about our loved ones. It appears that the conservative movement is out of step with the Constitution, out of step with the Bible, out of step with American values.
Is there a question
Well, yes,
coming?
sir, there is. Thank you. Would you help us tonight by calling off the right-wing departure from American values? Thank you.
Well, first of all, I wouldn't agree at all with your characterization of the support for giving Terry Schiavo's parents the opportunity to seek a hearing in federal court. I think you mischaracterized the position of those who take it, number one. And number two, I don't think Harry Reid is a right-wing Republican, and he voted for the legislation. He's the Democratic leader in the Senate. And of the roughly 100 Democrats who were present on Sunday, half of them voted for the legislation. So it was very bipartisan. It was very targeted. It does not set a precedent for future cases. This was a uniquely tragic situation in which a woman has suffered a terrible calamity and left no living will. And there is a dispute between her husband and between her parents. And that is so it's a double tragedy. Not only is she handicapped and disabled, but you have a conflict between her parents and her husband. And I think that insofar as we as Republicans put the 14th Amendment in the Constitution, making it clear that a person could not be deprived of life or liberty without due process of law, that was a federal amendment to govern the states. State courts do not have primacy and are not paramount under our constitutional system when it comes to matters of due process of law and equal protection and depriving someone of life. They just do not. And I think that allowing them to have a hearing was the right thing to do, and I'll tell you this, I know this is it's a tough issue, but I'm the father of a 16-year-old girl who's soon to be a woman, and if she is ever married to a man and were, God forbid, be in this kind of a tragedy, I can assure you that I would do everything in my power to save her life. I would do everything in my power to save her life.
Jennifer?
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Horacio Gutierrez. I'm a student here at the Kennedy School. I think it was impressive to see that the way that you organized the Christian Coalition and the impact it's had on the Republican Party over the last 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering, it's two questions. The first being whether you think there's any populations like that either the Republican Party or the Democratic Party can target that would have the same impact over the next couple of decades. And secondly, whether you think that the Democratic Party would be able to have any inroads into the same Christian Coalition membership that you created.
Well, I'm not generally in the position of giving advice to Democrats, so I'll probably demur on that aspect of your question. Really don't know as much about their party. I've not really been involved in the Democratic Party or its politics, and so it would be very difficult for me to offer any advice. I think for our party, for my party, there are really three constituencies of tremendous potential. The first I've already alluded to, the Hispanic community. I grew up in Florida before we moved to Georgia when I was a teenager. That is the most rapidly growing single constituency within the country. In my home state of Georgia, for example, we went from 60,000 Hispanics in the 1990 census to 250,000 in the 2000 census, and we're likely to be at somewhere between 400,000 and 500,000 in the 2010 census. And very shortly, Hispanics will surpass African Americans as the largest minority in my state, and I believe they may already have done so in the United States. If not, it's very close. So even though Hispanics register to vote and vote in smaller percentages, that will change. It'll be a multi-generational phenomenon. But the second and third generation of Hispanics will vote in very large numbers, in my opinion. And just as was the case with the Irish or the Italians or any other immigrant community, they will rise in their socioeconomic status and their civic engagement the longer they are here, particularly on a multi-generational basis. Secondly, African Americans. I know we didn't do as well in the African American community as we would have liked. I think we went from 9% of the vote to 12% of the African American vote, but there were pockets and states where we did extremely well. We got 16% of the African American vote in Ohio. We went from, I believe, 7 to 14% of the African American vote in Pennsylvania. And I think that there's a great deal of, because of the president's leadership on education, on No Child Left Behind, and on many values questions that African Americans share with their white co-religionists, I think there's opportunity for growth there. I don't think we're likely to win a majority of the African American vote in the near term, but we don't need to in order to be effective. We just need to do as well as we can. And if we could get to 20 to 25% of the black vote, in many states it would be a very important part of our majority. A third group would be the Jewish community. I think on issues relating to terrorism, relating to support for Israel, and many others, I think that Jewish voters are taking a second look at the Republican Party. We clearly overperformed among that constituency in 2004, and I think we'll continue to do so.
My name is Andrew Stober. I'm a first-year master's student here at the Kennedy School. Thank you very much for coming this evening before what is not necessarily an audience of friends. And along those lines, I'm curious as...
Everybody's been nice so far.
I'm curious as both a political strategist and now a candidate, how do you think it affects the president's leadership, his refusal to go before any public audience that includes anybody who might be not even hostile, but just maybe even disagree with his positions? Do you think that affects him as a leader?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't agree that he doesn't appear before audiences that aren't necessarily friendly. I've been at events with the president, and I've been at public forums where people are given the opportunity to answer questions or ask questions, and there are people there that don't agree with his policies. That's number one. And number two, I think the president is a great leader, and I think he's an inclusive leader. And I think that whether it was his recent meeting with the Congressional Black Caucus or the meetings that he's had with foreign leaders with which he has occasionally disagreed in European capitals during his recent trip to Europe, he's had many meetings with people who don't agree with him. And I don't think it's a problem at all.
Will your campaign events have people signing loyalty oaths before they come in?
Well, I'm running a little bit of a different campaign in that I'm not president, I don't have the same security issues. But as I said, I have been to many events where people didn't agree with the president and were able to say so freely.
Right here.
Good evening. I would just like to say I think you made a very nice, calm presentation, and I was glad to hear it. But I would like to ask if you could make some comments about the phenomenon of this very large proportion of American populace which classify themselves as evangelicals and which are predominantly supporting the policies of our president. And I assume that the people who are evangelicals are claiming to be strong adherents to the teaching of Christ and the Bible. And I find it a little bit puzzling for me to understand how it is that they are so supportive of a policy that has resulted in the invasion of a country which was not threatening us and has resulted in the death of approximately 100,000 Iraqi civilians, half of whom are estimated to be women and children. And we have engaged in torture, which is not the sort of thing you would say if you really believed in do unto others as you would have them do unto yourself, in Cuba, Iraq, and Afghanistan. And so there's been this business of torture, and this is coupled with the fact that we have had 1,524 of our own boys and girls killed and 12,000 of them seriously injured. So I would like to know how it is that the evangelicals sign on to this policy of killing and torturing.
Well, I just don't think that's an accurate characterization of
Could you tell
their
why?
views. Yeah, I will tell you why. If you're referring to the abuses at Abu Ghraib
Guantanamo in Afghanistan.
and others, they don't support that, and the president doesn't support that, and he's made that clear, and there are disciplinary procedures underway and court martials underway for those who are responsible. So I don't think it's fair or accurate to suggest that either the president supports those abuses or that his grassroots supporters support those abuses. They do not. That's number one. Number two, in terms of the military action in Iraq, the reason why they support it is because the regime of Saddam Hussein was the bloodiest and most dangerous regime in the bloodiest and most dangerous region in the world. And this is a man who put 300,000 of his own people in shallow graves, maintained rape rooms and torture rooms, executed or maimed or otherwise tortured not only his political opponents, but in many cases members of the entire family, aided, abetted, and funded terrorism, including providing sanctuary to Abu Nidal, who was at that time the most notorious terrorist in the world, contacting Osama bin Laden. This, by the way, is in the September 11th Commission report. Contacted Osama bin Laden, who was then in the Sudan, and invited him to come to Baghdad and to have sanctuary in Baghdad, and who we also know from the September 11th Commission report paid the North Koreans $10 million for long-range missile technology so that he could deliver missiles into any capital in Europe. Now, the removal of that regime has not only made Iraq a better place, it's made the Middle East a better place, and it's made the world a better place, and that's why they support it.
Right here.
Hi, Mr. My name is Steve Grove. I'm a student here at the Kennedy School. I was very interested in what you were saying about how Republicans have sort of out-organized Democrats at the grassroots level, and I'm particularly interested in the religious community, especially in Florida, how you seem to be able to organize religious folks, particularly folks who go to church. And first of all, I'm just curious how you did that. What was your methodology for organizing these religious communities around these churches? And second of all, I wonder how often you ran into, and this strikes me as sort of being at the crux of a lot of what you do as a member of the Christian Coalition and also in politics, how you run against the crux of is religion tainting politics, is politics tainting religion? I mean, is that an issue that you have to deal with a lot when you're organizing religious communities, or?
No, not really. And just to be clear, my role in the Bush campaign was not to organize the churches. I haven't been at the Christian Coalition in 8 years. So I was the chair of the campaign. And our job was to identify people who supported the president, be they Republican, Democrat, or Independent, black, brown, white, or yellow, Jewish, Christian, Catholic, Protestant. And that's what we did. So I did Jewish community events. You know, I went to Hispanic community events. And the way we did it was really not all that complicated. We went into all those areas and we conducted voter registration drives. We registered people to vote. We signed up volunteers. We had 73,000 volunteers in Florida alone. And then when we signed those people up, we asked them to commit to either making phone calls or walking door to door or whatever they did. But it was not really a church-based activity. Clearly, there were some voters who were church-going that we knocked on their door, but when we walked into a neighborhood, we didn't go, well, they're not a Christian, skip that house. You know, we went to every house, and that's how we won. I think if you just target it at a narrow demographic, I don't think you can win. That's why I really wanted to emphasize in my remarks tonight, splitting the women's vote, winning the veterans' vote, winning the Catholic vote, getting 44% of the Hispanic vote. In Florida, by the way, it was 56% of the Hispanic vote. That's how you win. The idea that you go out and win by turning out one particular group of voters, you know, who goes to a particular church or temple, mosque, or synagogue, in my opinion, is not an effective strategy.
Well, I wasn't trying to insinuate that. I was just curious about that particular segment of your strategy. And if
It was no different than every other group. And it was no different. It was, you know, you register people to vote, you identify who's for you, and you turn them out.
Up here?
Hi, my name's Paloma. I'm a junior at the college. Howard Dean and Hillary Clinton have both recently made overtures towards the pro-life segment of the population. Do you believe that Democrats can make an effective move to the center on moral or social issues and an inroad into the evangelical vote?
I doubt it. I doubt it because in the end, it's not about style or rhetoric, it's about positions on the issues. Now, if the Democratic Party or their presidential nominee in 2008 is in a different place on some key issues, then maybe so, but I don't, it doesn't seem likely to me. I could be wrong. I don't want to rule it out, but I think it will be very, it'll be very difficult given where the party is and where their leaders are on some of these key issues.
My name is Michael. I'm a first year in the MPP program here at the Kennedy School. I have a question about Northeast Republicans and essentially about that small segment that's still there, the conservative Democrats and the more liberal or more moderate Republicans.
Right.
I'm a New Yorker, I'm a Republican, I admit that in this forum, but often, yes, they already know that. It's tough for us. In New York City, we finance these campaigns, we work on these campaigns, we bring stars to the national spotlight, the ones you named,
Right.
Rudy, George Pataki.
Right.
But where do we go from there? How do we, as a party in New York, in these Northeast states on the West Coast, who want to be part of the national movement, but understandably need to tweak our message to meet our environment that we're in so that
Right.
we can win campaigns and can be in power, how do we become part of the celebration, part of the movement?
Well, I personally think you already are. I think if you look at the campaign and you look at who the top surrogates were and who some of our top speakers were, you know, Rudy Giuliani and George Pataki and Arnold Schwarzenegger, I think it's rather ironic that here we are at the Kennedy School and virtually the highest ranking Kennedy in government today is a Republican, Arnold Schwarzenegger. And you know, we have a pretty expansive view of this.
Well, I guess what I'm asking very specifically, having worked on the convention and brought some of these people there, how do we move beyond these statewide offices?
You mean to
essentially have
president or
the
vice
chance
president?
to run for those national
Well, you have to
offices?
run. I mean, you just, somebody's got to go out there and run. Now, you know, Schwarzenegger is prohibited by the Constitution.
We understand that.
I think it's unlikely that that's going to be amended in time for him to run. He may have a different view, I don't know. But, you know, in terms of Mayor Giuliani, who's a good friend and I'm a big fan of, and he came in and campaigned for our candidates when I was state party chairman, and I have a great relationship with him. And I think you can agree to disagree on a few issues and still be not only a good Republican, but a great Republican. But, you know, Rudy's got to decide what he wants to do. Is he going to run for governor of New York, or is he going to run for president? So you've got to field the candidates, and you've got to put forward a positive message. I don't believe that having a different view on some of those issues is an insuperable obstacle with the right kind of candidate, and I certainly know that our party is much more accommodating and welcoming of people who disagree with our position as a party or our platform or our nominee than the Democrats are. I mean, if you look at our convention and you look at our campaign, we had a lot of people in leadership positions in our campaign who didn't agree with me or with our two nominees on some key issues, and it was never a problem. And I think the real question is on the other party. What are they going to do to start making their party more welcoming of people who don't agree with them? I think it certainly didn't hurt us. I think it helped us that Zell Miller was delivering a speech at our convention and not their convention.
All right, there's only time for one last question. I see, Michael, you opened. I guess you get to close.
Okay. Well, I'm Micah.
Last question.
Okay. I'm a freshman at the college, and I'm also very involved in the Christian community here. And I was wondering, I think it's very clear that helping the lot of the less fortunate and the poor is a clear tenet of our faith.
Right.
And I was wondering how you felt that George Bush and kind of with faith-based initiatives in the Republican Party has heeded this call, and how in the future the Republican Party can kind of compete with the Democrats on this traditionally liberal issue of helping those less fortunate.
Well, I think the president has led in this area. He's led in the area of the faith-based initiative, which you mentioned. He's also led in the area of education reform. I mean, the truth of the matter is, if you look at No Child Left Behind and other education reforms that he has advocated, whether it's the Jobs for a 21st Century program, which includes about $1 billion in new job training program and technical education, primarily for community colleges, to help people who can't get into college or don't go to college get trained so that they can get a job in this rapidly changing economy. That really wasn't for his constituency, frankly. It wasn't something that they were as concerned about as the people who are affected by it, who are primarily either minority or poor white students in either inner cities or rural areas who are going to substandard schools. Most of the core supporters of the president are already in quality schools. The No Child Left Behind initiative was not something, although they supported it, it was not something that necessarily affected them. And so I think he has done that. I also think the expansion of Medicare and the adding of the prescription drug benefit for seniors. The Democrats had a majority in Congress for 40 years. And Bill Clinton could have proposed and enacted a prescription drug benefit. They never did it. The president came in and enacted it. I'm not saying that it's perfect the way it is, but as the son of a rural physician, I can tell you that the aid that went to community hospitals in that bill, the addition of the prescription drug benefit, and an ending of the discrimination in Medicare reimbursement rates between suburban physicians and rural physicians will help us attract more doctors and specialists to rural areas. My view is, I just don't think politics is nearly as complicated as we sometimes make it. Just go in there and do what you think is the right thing to do and try to help as many people as you can, and don't really worry about whether or not you get credit for it or not. I don't think the president's gotten very much credit for any of the things that I've just talked about. Doesn't matter. Just go in there and do the right thing. Try to help as many people as you can. Try to improve as many lives as you can. And let the verdict take care of itself. Thank you all very much.
Thank you all for coming. I think there are a number of Democrats in the audience hoping that it's wrong that there are even smarter people on the other side, but thank you all, and thank you, Ralph Reed, for being here.